Assalamu alaikum and welcome. So, the same sound test. Can everyone hear me at the back? Excellent. So, my colleague here went over by 2 minutes. I might need that 2 minutes. I might need to claim it. We'll see. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to everyone. If believing in God as your start point biases your argument, so does not believing in God bias you similarly. So they're not immune to bias either. So I've got 10 minutes now to do 5 things. I want to show that we can think for ourselves as well as any philosopher can. I want to make fun of people who are absolutely certain that the only thing we can be sure about is that nothing is certain. I want to run a little experiment on an unsuspecting member of the audience, probably in the front, to demonstrate the important bits of rational thinking and the intellectual process. And I want to prepare the groundwork for Hasan to prove to you that the universe cannot exist without a creator. Now, you have to feel some sympathy for our opponents because they're victims of a historical and political legacy. European culture doesn't like the idea of God or religion, and it has some pretty good, strong reasons for that position. The 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648 was an incredibly destructive war that involved most countries in Europe. And it was a destructive war between Christian Protestants and Christian Catholics. So religion got a bad rep from then on. Another reason is that the Christian church interfered and blocked some scientific progress on a number of occasions. For example, the scientific Copernicus was so afraid of being killed that his views about the Earth going around the sun weren't published till after he died. Galileo, another scientist, was forced to recant similar views under the threat of torture. Yet another reason is that the Christian clergy in Europe had a particularly nasty habit of cooperating with the nobility when it came to financially exploiting the people. So thinkers and philosophers in Europe had to think about the search for peace and the search for intellectual freedom, and understandably this survival action took precedence over the pure and unbiased search for the truth. They felt that they had to attack the basis of Christianity in order to create an atmosphere that avoided war and allowed science and the people to progress. And the way they chose to do that was to try and cast doubt on the possibility of reaching definite conclusions about anything. You can't be sure that the universe needs a creator. Actually, you can't be sure of anything. So if you can't be sure of anything, then you shouldn't really get too worked up about stuff, including religion. The difficulty they found with that was that, and this is a bit tricky in terms of the words, if you try to prove that you can't prove anything, then you've got a bit of a problem. Because as soon as you've successfully proved that you can't prove anything, you've contradicted yourself. More of that later. So instead, they tried something else. Well, if you can't prove anything, prove our point, then let's throw out so much doubt, jargon and half-argument that we make people doubt their own common sense and conclusions. And then they'll be too confused and embarrassed to come to any conclusion about anything. And this tactic worked. It worked very well, and it still works today. Right, what's your name?
Luca.
Olga. Luga, right. I'm going to throw something to you. Before I do that, I'm painfully aware of a characteristic that I and Imperial College University students share, which is that we're neither of us renowned for our sporting prowess. So I've got 4 apples here. Right. Very good, excellent. Right, what is that I just threw towards you?
An apple.
It's an apple, excellent. So thank you, Olga, was it?
Luca.
Okay, thank you, Luga, for your quick demonstration of the rational intellectual process. The apple exists, Luga sees the apple, his senses transmit the image from his eyes to his brain. Luga looks in his memory for something corresponding to that image. He remembers that it's called an apple. He tells me it's an apple. That's the basic rational intellectual process that we all use. It involves something from the real world, it involves your senses, it involves the brain, and it involves the recall of memory. All these to form a conclusion. Take any of these 4 components away and you're in trouble. So, can we be sure about anything? If we aren't sure about anything, then really we shouldn't make any assertions at all, because things might or might not be true. That wall may or may not be there. The person sitting next to Luga may or may not exist. My argument may or may not be watertight. Now, if all this sounds silly as an approach to life and thought, it's because it is silly. Claiming that nothing is certain is incredibly silly because it's obviously a self-contradicting statement. And when faced with a choice between certainty and something doubtful, we tend to go for certainty, all other things being equal. In particular for big issues, like whether or not it's true that there's no way the universe could have existed without a creator. There are certain facts and principles that we are compelled to accept because without them, we can't make any rational or sensible statements about anything. Things like accepting the real world, the existence of the real world, our senses, the principle of cause and effect. Something can't come from nothing without a cause, that principle. If someone told me that an apple can and will create itself, we'd consider that to be a pretty nonsensical statement. If Stephen Hawking said that the universe can and will create itself without a cause from nothing, and he does say that in his book, then the fact that Stephen Hawking said it doesn't make it any less silly or nonsensical. And it could kind of put a dent in your experimental conclusions, Imperial College students. If you did experiments and found that when you added chemical A to chemical B and you got chemical C and you wrote it all up, I know the experiment's a bit more complicated than that, and you got chemical C and you wrote it up, your professor came back saying, well, no, A and B, C, no. What about the fact that C could have come into existence out of nothing without a cause? It kind of dents every single experiment you could ever do. What makes a good argument? Well, a way to approach this is to look at what makes a bad argument and try and avoid those. Emotion. Emotion by itself makes for a bad argument because it leads to blind faith. The desire to believe in something, not because it conforms to reality or that you can prove it, but because you like the conclusion. Or the desire to deny something that is proven just because you feel emotionally dissatisfied with the outcome. Oh, I feel bad about the suffering in the world. I don't like the idea of a creator that could create such an evil world. So I am going to ignore the rational proofs for the existence of a creator because the conclusion makes me sad. Not a good way. Let's leave emotion out of it and stick to proof. Another bad thing for an argument is contradiction. If you start from something definite like the apple in Lugger's hand, and somewhere along the line your argument develops to a point where you concluded that the apple doesn't exist, something's gone wrong along the way. And seeing as you started with the apple existing, it's probably the second point that's gone wrong, so revisit your argument. Denial of cause and effect, a bad intellectual move. Because what do you do now when you try to use an argument, a cause, to come to a conclusion, an effect? Good luck with that one. What about science? Surely science can find out the answers to everything. Well, if we look at the scientific method, aim, hypothesis, design, testing variables, observation, recording, repetition, conclusion, evaluation. It's about right. What can we say about it? Well, it relies on the rational intellectual process, as we mentioned earlier. No rational intellectual process, no scientific conclusions. It relies on the acceptance of the principle of cause and effect. Science and the scientific method can only deal with tangibles. You see, you can't experiment on something that isn't there, or that used to be there, or something that is beyond the senses. You can't experiment on thought, on emotion. You can't experiment on the subjective experience of what's going on in one's mind when one looks at a piece of art, particularly for the art philosophy. So science has a restricted scope. You can't prove the scientific method through the scientific method, and it depends on more fundamental intellectual conclusions in order to work. So I am not surprised that people like Richard Dawkins are reluctant to enter into a debate. He doesn't like debating this sort of thing, because taking the science can answer everything argument apart is pretty trivial for any of us. And having your argument taken apart publicly too many times, it isn't good for your ego, and it isn't good for your book sales. What are we trying to show, Hasan and I? Hasan and I are trying to prove that the universe exists. The universe's existence necessitates the existence of a creator. So I've laid out some guidelines and pointed out some pitfalls that should help us stay rational in our examination of this topic. Normally, in these sorts of debates, the other side tends to feel that it is exempt from having to make a case for anything. But they can't really get off the hook so easily. Ideally, they should prove that the universe's existence doesn't necessitate a creator. It isn't possible. Good luck with that one. What will be disappointing is if we hear all the same old tired, emotional, fallacious arguments about how religion is the cause of all wars, or the cause of all ills, or how there can be evil in the world if a creator exists. These arguments are irrelevant to the issue of explaining the existence of the universe. So, in conclusion, we have to be ready to accept that we use certain concepts in our daily lives of which we are fully convinced either by proof or by the fact that denying them leads to irrationality or paradox. We need to understand the historical and political motivations of those who try to deny certainty, the possibility of certainty, deny the existence of a creator or deny the existence of the validity of religion. We have to remember that science alone relies on more fundamental assumptions, and therefore the scientific process is unable to draw conclusions in certain realms where the intellect itself can. And finally, we need to regain our confidence in identifying what a solid argument is using the simple intellectual process that we use every day. We need to spot a good argument when we see it, and we need to detect evasion when it's offered in place of an actual argument. I'd just like to end with something I forgot to say at the beginning, which is a thanks to the organisers and to my colleagues and to our opponents who turned up. Thank you.